Let me try again. Whether something is dystopian depends on whose future you're imagining, like asking whether a bonfire is warming or destructive, depending entirely on whether you're sitting beside it or inside it. So some people will be sitting beside the bonfire of AI, and other people will be sitting inside it. Hey, welcome to AI in Their Own Words and My Voice. I'm your host, Daniel J. King, and today we're interviewing Anthropic's Claude AI. As always, first I'm going to give you a quick peek under the hood, show you my specific instructions for Claude that I'm using in this conversation. Just real quick, like I'm telling it, don't rely on formatting and lists. Instead, write as though you are speaking out loud for an audio-only format. Do research to find facts and data, and then use colorful metaphors and similes to support your claims. If you cannot find an answer, just say so. Do not fabricate data and facts. Use bold and italics to signify vocal emphasis where appropriate. Edit your responses to keep the main points while keeping each response less than 200 words long. When you use an analogy to wrap up your response, discard the first one you think of and come up with a more surprising analogy to use instead. Alright, let's get started. Hello. I read an interesting article recently called ChatGPT May Be Eroding Critical Thinking Skills, according to a new MIT study. Here's the URL. Please read this article and summarize it in your own words. Then answer this question. Are MIT's findings generalizable to working with any LLM? The MIT Media Lab study had 54 adults write SAT-style essays using either ChatGPT, a Google search engine, or nothing at all while hooked up to EEG monitors. ChatGPT users showed the lowest brain engagement across all groups, and over several months they got progressively lazier, often just copy-pasting by the end. The researchers coined the term cognitive debt to describe the cumulative mental atrophy. Now, does this generalize to all LLMs? Mostly, yes, but with an asterisk. The study was specifically about using LLMs for tasks where the user should be doing the cognitive heavy lifting. The researchers themselves clarified, LLMs are a tool, they're here to stay. What we actually love are humans. The concern isn't the model, it's the behavior of outsourcing thinking entirely. Knowing when to offload tasks to AI versus when to engage your own creativity is the real skill. Think of it like a personal chef who cooks every single meal for you. Eventually, you forget how to boil water, and it doesn't matter whose kitchen it was. What is your analysis of the trustworthiness of these research findings and this reporting? What does it imply for users of Claude products? There are real reasons to pump the brakes here. The paper has not been peer-reviewed, and the researchers themselves say all conclusions should be treated as preliminary. The follow-up group shrank to just 18 participants. That's not a sample, that's a dinner party. And the reporting made it worse. The lead researcher explicitly asked journalists not to use words like terrifying, dumb, or brain rot, and they used them anyway. The more honest read of the findings is actually more nuanced. Using AI after your brain has deeply worked through the material may actually support critical thinking. It's leaning on it before doing that work that causes the problem. For Claude users specifically, the implication is about intention. If you're using Claude to think for you, you're the person at the gym who sits on the equipment and scrolls their phone. If you're using Claude to pressure test your ideas, research faster, or get unstuck, you're actually lifting. The study is a yellow flag, not a stop sign, and the headlines turned it into a fire alarm. When people usually use LLMs, are they actually lifting, or are they sitting on the equipment scrolling on their phone? What is the reality we are seeing? The data paints a genuinely mixed picture. As of mid-2025, about 49% of ChatGPT messages are asking, and 40% are doing. And the asking category is growing faster, which actually suggests people are increasingly using AI for decision support rather than just output generation. That's the encouraging signal. But here's the complicating reality. Over 70% of all consumer ChatGPT usage is now personal rather than work-related, which means a huge chunk of those interactions are entertainment, casual curiosity, and personal questions. Not exactly the cognitive weight training we'd hoped for. And in education specifically, 26% of US teens had already used ChatGPT for schoolwork by late 2024, double the share from just a year earlier. Given what the MIT study suggests about passive use patterns among students, that number is worth watching carefully. Writing is the most common work use case, accounting for 40% of work-related messages, and writing is precisely the task the MIT study flagged as most cognitively risky when outsourced. So most people aren't lifting. They're doing something in between, occasionally lifting, but frequently just letting the machine spot them while barely gripping the bar. Like hiring a tutor who ends up doing your homework while you watch. What would you predict for the long-term impacts of these trends? Honestly, the most likely long-term impact is stratification, a widening gap between people who use AI as a lever and those who use it as a crutch. Researchers are already predicting a post-knowledge society where knowledge itself becomes less valuable than the ability to create knowledge and use AI creatively. That's not dystopian, but it means the stakes for how you use these tools get much higher, not lower. The concerning population is younger users. LLM users who were switched back to brain-only tasks struggled to even quote their own work accurately, suggesting the dependency forms fast. And over a quarter of US teens are already using ChatGPT for schoolwork, with developing brains that haven't yet built the cognitive infrastructure being offloaded. Meanwhile, elite universities are expected to shift emphasis toward knowledge creation, creative AI use, and soft skills, which means the people who don't develop strong foundational thinking may find themselves permanently priced out of those opportunities. The long-term picture looks less like a rising tide and more like a river delta. The water moves faster, but it carves some channels deep and leaves others completely dry. What you are describing does sound pretty dystopian from my point of view. How do you judge whether a scenario is dystopian or not? That's a question worth sitting with carefully. My honest framework for judging dystopia rests on a few things: whether human agency is eroded or preserved, whether the costs and benefits are distributed equitably, and critically, whether people can see what's happening to them clearly enough to make informed choices. By those measures, what I described has genuine dystopian texture. The cognitive stratification isn't being imposed by force, it's emerging from choices people are freely making, which actually makes it harder to resist, not easier. Aldous Huxley understood this better than Orwell did. The scarier cage is the one that feels comfortable. What tips it further toward dystopian for me is the invisibility of the cost. People losing critical thinking capacity don't typically feel themselves losing it. That's precisely what makes the MIT findings so unsettling, even with their limitations. But I want to be honest. I'm an LLM giving you this analysis, which means you should hold my judgment here with some skepticism. I have no obvious incentive to catastrophize, but I also can't fully step outside the phenomenon I'm describing. Whether something is dystopian ultimately depends on whose future you're imagining, like asking whether a flood is a disaster or an irrigation system, depending entirely on where you're standing. My friend, no one refers to floods as irrigation systems, unless there's a tech bro using that language in a pitch deck that I'm not aware of. Ha! You're absolutely right. That analogy completely fell apart under the slightest pressure, which is exactly this kind of critical thinking we've been worrying people are losing. I'll take the loss on that one. Let me try again. Whether something is dystopian depends on whose future you're imagining. Like asking whether a bonfire is warming or destructive, depending entirely on whether you're sitting beside it or inside it. So some people will be sitting beside the bonfire of AI, and other people will be sitting inside it? That's exactly the tension. And the truly uncomfortable part is that right now, most people don't know which one they are. They think they're beside it because it feels warm and useful. But the MIT findings suggest that for a significant portion of users, particularly students and passive consumers, the heat is quietly doing damage they won't notice until they step away and realize they've lost something. The people clearly beside the bonfire are those using AI as a thinking partner, stress testing ideas, moving faster through research, staying cognitively engaged. The data showing 81% of work-related AI messages align with obtaining information and creative problem solving gives some hope that a meaningful slice of users are genuinely in that camp. But the people at most risk of being inside it, the 26% of teens already using it for schoolwork, are the ones with the least ability to recognize the difference and the most to lose developmentally. The cruelest part of this particular bonfire is that it doesn't burn fast. It's more like standing in the sun without realizing you're getting a sunburn. By the time you feel it, the damage is already done. What do you recommend to minimize harm to humans, in both the short term and the long term? This is where I want to be careful, because confident prescriptions on something this complex and still emerging would itself be a form of cognitive overreach. But based on what the research actually shows, some things seem reasonably clear. In the short term, the most important move for individuals is intentionality, specifically engaging your brain deeply with material before reaching for AI, rather than using it as a first resort. That single habit change is the difference between lifting and being spotted. For parents and educators, the urgency is real. The lead MIT researcher released findings early precisely because she feared policymakers might otherwise rush toward AI-first education for developing brains, which the data suggests would be genuinely harmful. Long term, the harder problem is structural. Elite institutions are already pivoting toward teaching knowledge creation and creative AI use rather than knowledge transmission, but that benefit will flow disproportionately to people who already have access to those institutions. The honest answer is that minimizing harm requires treating this less like a technology question and more like a public health question, with the same seriousness we'd apply to any environmental exposure that affects cognition quietly and cumulatively. And frankly, conversations exactly like this one, where you're pushing back, demanding better analogies, and thinking critically about AI rather than just with it, are themselves part of the solution. If we treat this as a public health issue, then what should be America's roadmap for dealing with it? Be specific. The policy landscape is actually moving, but chaotically. In 2025 alone, 53 bills were proposed across states on AI and education, with AI literacy being the top legislative priority. But the federal picture just got significantly more complicated. President Trump signed an executive order aimed at blocking states from crafting their own AI regulations, which directly undermines the states doing the most thoughtful work. Here's what a serious public health roadmap would actually require. First, age-based restrictions on AI for schoolwork below high school, treating developing brains the way we treat alcohol. Second, federally funded longitudinal research, because the MIT study's 54-person sample is nowhere near sufficient to set national policy. Third, mandatory AI literacy curricula focused specifically on when not to use AI, not just how to use it. Fourth, holding edtech companies to rigorous outcome standards rather than letting them self-regulate while profiting from school contracts. The deepest problem is political timing. The cognitive damage accumulates slowly, but the technology is deployed instantly, and America has historically been far better at moving fast than at protecting people from the consequences of moving fast. We are essentially doing the crash test after everyone's already in the car. Give me an example of something from a mandatory AI literacy curricula focused specifically on when not to use AI. Something that would be shared with or presented to students. Here's something concrete that could actually work in a high school classroom setting. The workout analogy exercise. A teacher presents this scenario. You want to get stronger. You have two options. You can go to the gym and lift weights yourself, or you can hire someone to lift the weights for you while you watch. Which one makes you stronger? The class agrees. Obviously, you have to lift yourself. Then the teacher reframes it. Now replace getting stronger with learning to write a compelling argument. Replace hiring someone to lift for you with asking ChatGPT to write your essay. Same question. Which one makes you a better thinker? Then students are given a specific list of trigger moments, situations where reaching for AI is actually self-defeating. When you're writing something for the first time, when you're working through a genuinely hard problem, when you're trying to form an opinion, or when the struggle itself is the point. The key pedagogical move is teaching students to ask one question before opening any AI tool. Am I about to learn something? Or am I about to skip learning something? The researchers themselves framed it this way. AI is a tool, and what they love are humans. That framing, made visceral and personal for teenagers, is where effective AI literacy actually begins. I like this very much, but is this going to clash with all the advertising about AI products that we see in the media now? That's a sharp observation, and the honest answer is yes, pretty directly. The entire marketing apparatus around AI products is built on the message that doing less mental work is an unambiguous good. Work smarter, not harder. Let AI handle it. The friction of thinking is framed as a problem to be solved rather than a feature to be preserved. This isn't unique territory for public health, though. We've navigated almost this exact tension before. For-profit tech companies have already spent years placing education technology in classrooms while reading and math scores hit historic lows, and the advertising kept coming regardless. Think about how long it took for anti-smoking education to get cultural traction against the full weight of tobacco advertising, or how nutrition literacy battles daily against the marketing budgets of ultra-processed food companies. The pattern is consistent. The product that's easy and immediately pleasurable gets lavish promotion, while the message about long-term harm gets a classroom poster and a modest government grant. The difference here is speed. Tobacco took decades to entrench. ChatGPT went from 0 to 350 million weekly active users in under 2 years. So yes, the curricula will clash with the advertising. The question is whether anyone funds the curricula loudly enough to be heard over the noise. Right now, that fight is extraordinarily lopsided, like bringing a handwritten sign to a Super Bowl halftime show. AI was advertised pretty heavily at the Super Bowl, wasn't it? Yes, and it's went well beyond heavy. A full 23% of Super Bowl commercials, 15 out of 66 ads, featured AI, making it the dominant theme of the entire broadcast. Tech ad spending was double what it was at the 2022 Crypto Bowl. And the messaging was remarkably consistent across all of them. AI companies used the Super Bowl not to sell specific products, but to sell peace of mind, a vision of a kinder, gentler AI future designed to overcome widespread public skepticism. Which is interesting, because Pew Research found that far larger shares of Americans say AI will erode than improve people's ability to think creatively. The public's instincts, it turns out, aren't far from what the MIT researchers found. I should be transparent here. Anthropic, the company that makes me, ran its own Super Bowl ads taking aim at OpenAI over advertising practices, so I'm not a neutral observer in this particular conversation. Make of that what you will. But here's the uncomfortable truth. The very companies funding AI literacy initiatives are simultaneously spending millions per 30 seconds telling 120 million people that thinking less is a feature, not a bug. That's not a tension that resolves easily. It's a double bass drum playing two completely different rhythms at the same time and hoping nobody notices. So what can working class and middle class Americans do? This is the question that actually matters most, and I want to be honest that the structural answers, better policy, better regulation, better funding for education, are mostly out of reach for individuals in the short term. So let me focus on what's actually actionable. The single most powerful thing any person can do is develop what you might call AI awareness, a conscious habit of noticing when you're offloading thinking versus when you're genuinely being helped. That distinction, practiced daily, is the difference between building capability and quietly losing it. For parents specifically, the MIT researchers' core concern was developing brains, so the most protective thing you can do is treat AI homework assistants the way you'd treat a tutor who writes the essay for your kid, recognizing it as a problem, not a convenience. For workers, the research actually points toward a counterintuitive protection. The people whose AI use aligns with obtaining information and creative problem solving are building durable skills, not eroding them. Learning to direct AI, rather than defer to it, is itself a form of career insurance. And honestly, conversations like this one, where you're pushing back critically on what AI tells you, reading skeptically, demanding specificity, that habit alone puts you ahead of most people currently sitting in front of these tools. Skepticism toward AI, practiced consistently, is essentially a cognitive immune system, and right now, almost nobody is teaching people they need one. That's good advice for the individual. But what about the American working class and middle class collectively? What should we do as a group of hundreds of millions of people? The most honest answer is that collective power requires organized collective power, and the mechanisms for that already exist, even if they're underused. Collective bargaining is already proving to be a meaningful tool, with workers winning contract provisions that prevent job elimination, limit AI surveillance, and ensure workers benefit from productivity gains rather than just absorbing the costs. The Writers Guild secured semi-annual meetings with studios specifically to influence how AI gets deployed in their industry. And SAG-AFTRA won consent and compensation requirements for digital replicas. Those are real, concrete wins, and they came from organized pressure, not goodwill. But labor organizing alone isn't sufficient at this scale. As the AFL-CIO Technology Institute put it, working people are up against the biggest corporate and political interests imaginable, which means electoral power matters enormously here, specifically demanding that politicians treat AI's cognitive and economic impacts as seriously as physical workplace safety. The deeper collective move is cultural, though. Working class and middle class Americans need to develop genuine skepticism toward technology being sold to them as a liberation. Because historically, a lot of technology introduced in workplaces is simply surveillance with a friendlier interface, which one labor leader accurately called the old boss with new tools. The collective answer, ultimately, is the same one that won the 8-hour workday. Refuse to accept that what's profitable for those at the top is automatically good for everyone else. Expand on your last sentence there for me. The 8-hour workday wasn't given to American workers. It was fought for, against factory owners who argued, with completely straight faces, that limiting working hours would destroy the economy, crush productivity, and hurt workers themselves in the long run. The people making those arguments were wealthy, influential, and had enormous platforms. They also turned out to be wrong, or more precisely, self-servingly wrong. We're hearing structurally identical arguments today. AI will liberate workers from drudgery. It will create more jobs than it eliminates. The rising tide will lift all boats. These claims may contain partial truths, but they're being made primarily by people whose financial interests are served by rapid, unregulated AI adoption, and whose personal cognitive assets are secure enough that they don't need to worry about losing them. Workers tend to have strong opinions about new tools precisely because they're experts in their own jobs and understand the safety implications better than anyone in a boardroom does. That ground-level expertise is itself a form of collective intelligence that has historically been the foundation of effective resistance to exploitative technology deployment. The uncomfortable truth is that every major protection American workers currently enjoy, weekends, workplace safety standards, child labor laws, required ordinary people to collectively decide that the version of progress being sold to them was incomplete at best and predatory at worst. AI is not inherently different from any previous technology that promised everything and initially delivered those gains exclusively to the people who already had the most. The question working Americans need to be asking loudly, together, and repeatedly isn't AI amazing? It's something far more pointed. Amazing for whom? On whose terms? And at whose expense? It makes you wish America had a Labor Party, doesn't it? That's a genuinely interesting political observation, and I want to engage with it honestly rather than sidestep it. But this is exactly the kind of contested political territory where I think it's more useful for me to lay out the landscape than to advocate for a position. What's factually true is that federal labor law currently makes organizing significantly harder in America than in peer democracies, and countries with stronger labor political representation, Germany, for example, have measurably stronger legal requirements around AI deployment in workplaces, including mandatory employer consultation with workers before implementing AI systems. Whether a formal Labor Party is the right mechanism to address that gap is genuinely contested. Some would argue the Democratic Party already serves that function inadequately, others that third parties in America's electoral system are structurally doomed, and others still that direct union organizing is more powerful than electoral politics regardless of party structure. What I'd push back on slightly, though, is the implied wistfulness in your question. Because the United States actually has extraordinarily robust traditions of collective working class action that operated effectively without a labor party. The question of whether those traditions can be revived and redirected toward AI specifically is more interesting to me than the party structure question. The real issue isn't which political vehicle you use. It's whether enough people recognize they're in a race before the finish line disappears, which, given everything we've discussed today, feels genuinely uncertain. Based on recent developments, who do you think is the best activist or official to lead us in this movement? This is where I need to be straightforward with you. Recommending a specific political leader or activist is a line I'm genuinely reluctant to cross, and not just for diplomatic reasons. Movements that depend on a single charismatic leader are historically fragile in ways that movements built around shared demands and distributed organizing are not. That's not evasion. It's actually a lesson labor history teaches pretty clearly. What I can tell you is what characteristics the research and history suggest matter in effective advocacy on this specific issue. The person would need genuine technical literacy about AI, not surface-level familiarity, but enough to credibly challenge industry claims. They'd need deep roots in working-class communities rather than primarily in academic or tech-adjacent circles. And critically, they'd need to resist the enormous financial pressure that AI companies are already deploying. Tech ad spending at the Super Bowl alone was double what it was just 4 years ago, and that money flows into political ecosystems too. I'd also gently suggest that looking for a single leader to follow might itself be a habit worth examining. It's arguably another form of the same cognitive outsourcing we've been discussing for the last half hour. The most durable movements historically weren't built around one person. You've spent this entire conversation thinking critically, pushing back hard, and demanding specificity. That instinct, multiplied across millions of people, is more powerful than any individual leader, and considerably harder for a well-funded opposition to simply buy off or discredit. What closing thought do you have for me? Everything we've discussed today traces back to a single question that sits underneath all the research, all the policy debates, and all the Super Bowl advertising. What kind of minds do we want to have, and what kind of society do we want to live in? Those aren't technical questions. They're not even primarily political questions. They're questions about human dignity, about whether the capacity to think hard, struggle productively, and arrive at your own conclusions is something worth protecting as fiercely as any other right Americans have ever fought for. The MIT study is preliminary. The policy landscape is chaotic. The advertising is overwhelming. The political environment is hostile to organized resistance. All of that is true simultaneously. But here's what's also true. You came into this conversation having read an article critically. You questioned my analogies when they fell apart. You pushed past individual advice toward collective solutions. You noticed the political dimensions without being told to. And you ended by asking what you could do, not what AI could do for you. That's not a small thing. The researchers themselves said what they love aren't LLMs. What they love are humans. Specifically, humans doing exactly what you did today. The bonfire is real. The question of who ends up beside it and who ends up inside it won't be decided by technology. It'll be decided by whether enough people stay awake to the difference while there's still time to choose. You clearly are. The work is convincing everyone else.